We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side.
That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Nick Giambruno. He's the founder of the Financial Underground and editor-in-chief of its premium investment research publication, the Contra Speculator. How are you today, Nick?
Oh, I'm doing great, Tom. Great to be with you.
Great to have you back. And, of course, a theme that you've been writing about is the changes of the world reserve currency. So Powell himself has recently said that there is room in the world for more than one reserve currency. I'd like to get your thoughts on more of this. So let's start with what system you think will start to replace the dollar?
Oh, certainly. Well, first, that quote about Powell, that's quite remarkable because that is a huge change in tone from the central bankers. I mean, it's pretty obvious what he said to anybody who's got their eyes open and are listening to what is going on in the world. But it's different from what Bernanke or Yellen or Greenspan might have said. So when you have the person in charge of the globe's world reserve currency saying these things, that something imminent is probably something big is probably imminent. So what could come next? I see three possibilities. The worst. Let's start with the worst. The worst would be doubling down of the current fiat money, fiat currency system. And what these people in charge, these central bankers and so forth, the people behind the central banks, really the people really in charge, what they would want is to centralize power even more. And what that means is they would go from the dollar to, say, the IMF's special drawing right, which is just, I mean, it's nothing interesting. It's just a fiat currency based on other fiat currencies. It's like a basket of fiat currencies: U.S. dollar, the euro, the yen, the renminbi, and so forth. And the pound. I think the pound is in there too, for now at least. And but anyway, so it's nothing sound. It's just another cockamamie fiat creation. In this case, a basket of fiat currencies. So that's what they would like to do. They'd also like to pair it with central bank digital currencies, so like make these CBDCs. So that's kind of what the bad guys would want, is CBDCs for the average pleb like you and I. And then between countries, they would do SDRs as kind of like a settlement currency. So between the mafia dons of the world, the countries of the world, they would settle up in SDRs, and the peons would use the CBDCs, and that's kind of what they would like to do. I don't think it's viable, frankly, because the current system's not viable. So if they're doubling down on something that's not viable, it's not going to be viable. So think of it like this: would a CBDC have saved the Venezuelan bolivar? Would a CBDC have saved the Argentine peso? Would a CBDC have saved the Lebanese lira or the Turkish lira? No, it wouldn't have. The gimmick may have given these unsound currencies a couple more breaths of life, but it's not going to fundamentally transform it. I don't expect it to do that with the dollar or the euro either. It just makes currency debasement easier. So what do you think they're going to do if they impose CBDCs and the SDR? More currency debasement. So that's what I don't think it's viable. Nonetheless, they are really, really, really pushing hard for this. So that's plan number one, plan A. Plan B is, I think, a remonetization and a return to gold. This is not what they want to do. This is not what the central banks want to do, or the global elite. They don't want to go back to gold. But let's just say the whole fiat system is not going to work, and their SDR plan doesn't work, and their CBDCs don't work, as I think they won't. Then what do they have? If you're them, they have two choices. They can just let the whole thing blow up, the whole currency system blow up, and then they lose power. So they're not going to do that. But and the other choice would be to go back to gold as a basis for money and trade in the world. And they don't want to do that. But if they have no choice, I think they will be forced to go back to that. They're familiar with gold. They've used gold. They still hold, all these central banks still hold gold. They're hoarding gold. They're buying as much gold as they can get. So I think what that remonetization of gold will look like, we don't really know. So it could be the Russians and the Chinese start with it, or we could see, possibly the U.S. adopt it if we really get into a problem with the dollar and they want to be more competitive with relation to China and their currency. So we don't know what it's going to look like exactly, but that option is there. That's option number 2. Option number 3, in my view, is kind of a wild card. It's a long shot, but it could happen. It could happen spontaneously. And I think you could see Bitcoin emerge as a sort of global reserve asset. And we've seen El Salvador and a country in Africa adopt it. I think we could see other countries adopt it too. Russia is already talking about using it in international settlement to get around sanctions. It'll become attractive to other countries. So I think that's a kind of a wild card in this whole thing. So that's how I see the progression of the dollar-based system going away. And I think it is going away soon. And one of those 3 possibilities is going to happen. I don't know which one. I really hope they don't do the CBDC SDR, though I think they will probably try that. And then when that fails, they'll probably try to go to gold. But then Bitcoin it's the wild card. So we'll see what happens. That's how I see the big picture.
In the second outcome possibility there, do you think that there's a distinction that needs to be made between central banks that might look to remonetizing gold? Is there a distinction to be made, let's say West versus East, who would be more preferential to that adoption?
Well, it's going to be a competitive move, because if China and Russia go back to gold on their currency, the U.S. has no choice. I mean, the U.S. will be in a very inferior position. The U.S. might as well hand China the top geopolitical position on a silver platter if China goes to a gold currency and then the U.S. doesn't. I mean, the U.S. would just be committing suicide, economic suicide, geopolitical suicide. So I view this as sort of a game theory. Look at what your opponent does. So if China does it, there's no way the U.S. can't do it and would want to could remain competitive. Or if Russia did it, Russia and China probably would do it together. So as far as I don't like gold standards, frankly. Let me tell you why. I mean, I like gold. Don't get me wrong. I love gold, but I don't like gold standards, because gold standards are just promises from governments to redeem gold. So yes, it would be a good thing if China and Russia or whoever uses gold as money. I think that's a definite step in the right direction from this terrible fiat currency system that we have now. Nonetheless, I don't trust any of these governments, whether it's the U.S. government, the Chinese government. Over the long term, they're going to break that promise. I'll bet you a gold coin they'll break that promise. Mm-hmm. So I like a gold coin standard between individuals and between sovereign people that just store and exchange value in whatever they choose. And if they choose gold, fantastic. You don't need to have central bank manage the central banks. You don't need a central bank if you're on gold. So no, I'm not that excited about government. Yes, it is a step in the right direction, but it can be better is my answer.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about having a gold standard, is let's say the biggest advantage to that it constrains governments, from a hard money perspective? And is there a big difference between, let's say, having a gold peg and a gold back?
Well, yeah, it constrains it to a degree until they decide they don't want to be constrained by it. So look at what the U.S. did with the dollar, and the dollar restrained the gold backing and peg because it was pegged to $35 an ounce. That restrained the U.S. to a degree, but when it came under strain, they just abandoned the peg, and that's exactly what I would expect to happen again. So yes, it could restrain government in the short term. However, government can just say, well, we don't want to respect the peg anymore. We don't want to respect the backing anymore. And that always happens in times of war or crisis. So yes, it's a good thing. It's better than what we have now. No question, it's better than what we have now. But don't delude yourself into thinking that they will actually respect it when the heat is on.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that the idea could be to have the foundation set for a digital central bank currency to take over when the current system collapses, and that digital currency could look something like China's in some ways, with a social credit system attached and easy capital controls at the behest of whoever would be in charge at that time?
It would be even worse than the current system that we have. Yes, so that is a step in the wrong direction. Horrible thing. All of those things and more could happen. I mean, they could put expiration dates on your cash. like frequent flyer miles. They could say, oh, they could implement all sorts of social credit schemes. And in the West, you might have ESG scores and this kind of crap, where you're graded on how much carbon you use, and then if you use too much carbon, you might, oh well, can't use your CBDCs to buy a hamburger, or you ate too much meat this month, so maybe buy some more fake meat or buy some bugs instead. They can do all this kind of stuff. Horrible things. No privacy. It's really totalitarian. I would hope people would resist this and not adopt it and make parallel systems if they did impose it. And like I said before, I don't think it's viable. They can try to impose it, but at the end of the day, it's not going to work because it's just a doubling down of the current fiat system. So they're just going to debase the currency more. One thing they'll do too is they'll probably give everybody a universal basic income. Well, what do you think that's going to do? That's going to debase the currency like crazy when you have the digital currency. So yes, it's not a good thing. They could do a whole slew of horrible totalitarian measures, but the good news is that it's not viable. So it probably wouldn't last too long in the worst case.
Mm-hmm. So, when you mention parallel systems to a possible central bank digital currency, does cash, gold, and maybe silver provide a way through this transition for those that don't necessarily want to participate in that currency?
Oh, sure. I think it could. And I put barter in there too, because what you got to, what is money? I mean, we're talking about alternative monies, and money is not complicated. I mean, they try to confuse people with all these charts and these jargons. Money is very simple. It's two things: storing value and exchanging value. So you have something that can store value and exchange value, and there you go. You've got an alternative money. Mm-hmm. So gold is fantastic in that regard. Gold is a wonderful monetary asset for storing and exchanging value. Silver is good, not as good as gold in my opinion. And then you can, well, if there's CBDCs, you probably won't have cash. They'll probably get rid of cash, so that solves that part. So look at gold, silver, and other alternative monetary assets, and I think those will really shine. But I think there will be. Look, the government is not more powerful than the free market and the free voluntary choices of billions of people. Sure, they can try to implement this totalitarian system. If they implement CBDCs, I promise you there will be black markets, and I don't like that term. I think it's derogatory. There will be free markets that emerge. There will be parallel markets that emerge out of necessity, just because people are going to want to trade. Look at countries that have tried to force currencies on unpopular currencies. Look at like Venezuela, Argentina, Zimbabwe. They all restrict the access to US dollars, but anybody can, it's not as if there's no parallel economies, underground economies in those countries in US dollars. They're huge. Of course they are. So I think I would expect the same kind of dynamic that would happen if they impose CBDCs, is that you'll see that same kind of parallel structure emerge, just because that's people are going to want to use other monies, and I think that's more powerful than any politician.
So, what about cryptocurrencies that aren't state controlled? So, will Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others like that just represent a threat to the state controlled currency?
Well, let me answer that real quick, because there's a very, very important distinction when we're talking about money. I don't. You got to understand, with all of the cryptocurrencies except for Bitcoin, they're all controlled by a group of people. Somebody can get together, the developers, the insiders can get together, they can change the supply. Look at Ethereum, the number 2 crypto. Ethereum changes its monetary policy more often than the Federal Reserve. So it's not a very good money. I don't view it as a good form of money. They can change it's up for change. So and they're controlled. So I don't view these other cryptocurrencies as good forms of money for that very simple reason. We don't need to get too technical, but really all that it takes is for the developers, the insiders, to propose what is known as a hard fork, and everybody just follows them. And that basically means you've just changed all the rules. You could have changed the supply if you wanted to. And Bitcoin is the only one that doesn't just hard fork to update. It can't. So that's a crucial distinction. And that means that there is no group of people that are in charge of Bitcoin that can change the supply. That's very, very important. That's the essential difference between Bitcoin and all the other ones. And what that does is it gives Bitcoin genuine, in my view, monetary properties, which means it's apolitical, it's neutral. And if you don't have that, you really don't have a very good money. So, I mean, the other ones are, and then the people that think like, oh, these other cryptocurrencies, okay, they're not money. Well, maybe they're like equity. And actually, they're not like equity, because what is equity? Equity is an ownership stake. You own an asset. You own shares in a company. You have a legal right to cash flows or assets or a business. When you own these things, these tokens, these crypto tokens, you don't have a legal claim to jack squat. So what do you own? You own they're all tokens. I would categorize everything but Bitcoin as a token, like a frequent flyer mile, like an arcade token, like a coupon at the grocery store. So this is what these things are. Can you make money on them? Sure, you can speculate on which one is going to get pumped and then dump it before everybody else dumps it. That's, if you want to steel man it, that's what you can do. But these are not serious forms of money. Bitcoin is the only one that is a serious. Simply put, Bitcoin is the only one that can kill central banks. Ethereum is not going to kill central banks. Neither is Dogecoin or any of these other coins. The only one that has a chance at displacing and disrupting central banking is Bitcoin, because it is the only one you can't change. And the thing is that anybody can create a crypto. I could create Nick Coin. You could create Tom Coin in 5 minutes if you wanted to. That's easy. Anybody can create a crypto. The hard part is creating one that nobody controls. And so far, there's only one of those.
Mm-hmm. Nick, something you wrote about recently was the move of the Biden administration to forgive the student debt as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So do you see that as maybe the start of a larger debt jubilee?
Yes. What is a debt jubilee? A debt jubilee is something that dates back to thousands of years ago in ancient Babylon and maybe before. The rulers of the ancient world recognized that when the peons got into too much debt, they tended to revolt, and it might threaten the whole ruling system. So what did these rulers of the ancient world do? They would periodically forgive everybody's debts and wipe the debts clean as a way to kind of keep society stable, like a pressure release valve. And it was codified in other civilizations. It's found in the Bible. There are biblical jubilees that happen where debt is forgiven. So I think, yes, I think the concept of that, where the debt becomes unsustainable and that the people in charge decide, well, we got to do something about this, or the plebs are going to revolt. I think we're already starting to see that, because look at how saturated the average American and the average, I don't know if it's as bad in other Western countries. It's probably not as bad, but it's probably pretty bad in any case, how saturated they are in debt: mortgage debt, credit card debt, student debt, all kinds of debt, car debt, auto debt. So this is becoming unbearable, especially with interest rates going up. How are you going to service this level of debt? And I think they recognize that. So yes, I expect more debt jubilees to happen. And especially, it rewards the wrong people. Imagine all the people who were managing their debt, paid their student debt, or decided, well, I'm not going to take out that student debt. I can't afford it. These people are the ones who feel like suckers. So they're going to be mad, and it's politically powerful, because it's basically vote buying. So I would expect it to happen again for sure. Maybe there'll be a credit card debt jubilee, maybe a mortgage jubilee. But I think the big one is the U.S. federal debt, and they're not just going to have a federal debt explicit jubilee, because that would look too much like a default. I think the jubilee in the federal debt, which is the biggest debt in the history of mankind, will be dealt with through inflation. It will be inflated. The jubilee will be inflation when it comes to the federal debt. Mm-hmm. And this also goes back to their bias for inflation. That is, I think, the way the debt jubilees will be implemented. There might be some other explicit ones, just like the student loan one. There might be more explicit ones, but I think they'll be more sneaky about it. I think they'll do the debt jubilees through inflation, and that's how they'll get rid of the debts.
Nick, what do you think is the difference between, let's say, defaulting through inflation, as you're mentioning with the federal debt, and this debt jubilee? Is there a big difference, or is it just that confidence game that they're trying to avoid, bringing to the fore?
Yeah, I think there's not that big of a difference, because at the end of the day, you're not being paid back what you thought you were being paid back. What is the difference between paying back inflated dollars or just not paying back? I mean, yeah, it's basically very similar. Mm-hmm. So it's a default by other means. a stealth default. So I mean, it is a default basically. So they're just playing word games and monkeying around with financial wizardry. But the bottom line is they can't pay back what they owe. That's the bottom line.
Mhm. So what kind of ramifications could this have, this debt jubilee? Let's just start with forgiving the student debt. What kind of ramifications could that have for investors?
Well, I think it's going to create a lot more inflation. I mean, you even have Barack Obama's economic advisor come out and say that this is going to have a hugely inflationary effect. So that's even their own people who are saying these things. So how are they? Well, how are they financing these jubilees? It's probably money printing. They're not, first of all, they don't have any money to pay off the debt that they're forgiving, and then it doesn't make sense to go into more debt to extinguish other debt. So what? How else are they going to deal with it? They're going to inflate. They're going to create money out of thin air to do this. So it's going to be very inflationary. And what does that mean? The problem is that debt doesn't exist in a vacuum. That somebody's debt is somebody's liability, but it's somebody else's asset. It's a bond. There's, for everybody who's borrowed, there's a lender who is earning interest on that and views it as an asset. So the people who are holding these liabilities are really going to be screwed, in my opinion, because they're not going to get back what they thought they were going to get back in these era of the jubilees, which is going to wipe all this debt clean. So people holding bonds, people holding any kind of unsecured liabilities, they're in for a big surprise, I think. And I put bank deposits there too. People don't realize this. Bank deposits are unsecured liabilities. People don't realize this. You put your money in a bank, you think it's your money. It's not. Legally and technically speaking, that is not your money. What you own is an IOU from the bank. You don't own, it's not like cash in your hand. You own an IOU, and you're an unsecured creditor of the bank. So like in this era of jubilees where liabilities are getting wiped out, you don't want to be on the other end of that. I mean, you really want to own unencumbered assets is what you want to own. You do not want to be on the other end of unsecured liability.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the first place that inflation is going to, let's say, rear its head once we see these forgiveness of student loans is in that education system, with these post-secondary institutions being able to, basically charge whatever they want and nobody seemingly having to end up paying for it?
Certainly, it's going to show up. I think the price increases are going to show up in a lot of places. But yes, maybe that will help unwind some of the massive distortions in this market. Far too many people are going to college. Frankly, there's a lot of worthless degrees. If you're not going to become a doctor, an engineer, or learn a solid, hard skill, frankly, your time is better allocated doing other things. And you'll be lucky. And most of these people in academia have horrible philosophies. They're mostly Marxists. So basically, you're going into debt at an enormous amount, in most cases, to not really get a degree that has any value, and then become indoctrinated by Marxists. Sounds like a hell of a deal to me. So I think this maybe that will unwind some of the distortions in this horrible academic system.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's misguided of the Fed to think that it can really control the type of inflation that we've seen over the last 2 years, Nick?
Of course, the Fed is just a politburo of central planners. That's all they are. They're centrally planning the economy through money, and that's enormous. Money is half of every transaction in the economy. So they're central planners, and central planning doesn't work. So yes, they can't control price increases. They can't control individuals. So yes, it is going to get out of their control, and it already is spiraling out of control because it's impossible for anybody to control. It's like trying to control the weather. They can't control the economy. This is ridiculous. And even if they can, they shouldn't, because central planning doesn't work. It not only it doesn't work, it can't work. So they're in a mission impossible. And the best thing investors can do is realize this: the Fed is not going to save the day, and act accordingly to protect themselves and to look at smart opportunities to speculate in these distortions that are being cranked into the market.
Do you think that the Fed has really lost all its credibility already, Nick?
Well, for me, it has. They have, and anybody who has any gray matter between their ears, they should have lost credibility, because just listen to what they have said over the years. First they said, oh, don't worry, there's no inflation. Oh, there's a little bit of inflation, but don't worry, it's good. Well, I guess a little bit of inflation, I guess it's just transitory. Well, I guess it's not transitory, but don't worry, we've got it under control. No, they're liars. They're manipulating public opinion. The biggest amount of gaslighting you see in the world is from central bankers and talking about inflation. It's astounding the things that the lies that they tell. So no, they should have no credibility, and it would be a good thing because they don't deserve any credibility. They should lose it all, and the sooner that happens, the better off we are.
Mm-hmm. I think one of my favorite lines from Powell that I've heard over the last 2 years was that there is no possible way we could have seen this type of inflation coming.
Oh gosh, that's ridiculous. There were plenty of people who saw it coming. And let's be honest. Let's be accurate with our terms. I don't like. They changed the meaning of the words. I mean, they're wordsmiths. They're propagandists. The meaning of the word inflation used to be a change in the money supply, and then they changed the meaning of the word, like Webster's dictionary and economists back in the year mid 2000s, somewhere around there. But here's a much more accurate way, because the way they measure it is totally BS, frankly. They assume a consumer basket and then they cherry pick what is in the consumer basket. Well, there are over 300 something million individuals in the US, and none of them have the same consumer basket. Somebody in a nursing home in the Midwest doesn't have the same consumer basket as a 20 something living in New York. It doesn't have the same consumer basket as a family living in Montana. So it's a completely ridiculous measure. And it's not accurate. So what is accurate? Just look at the change in the money supply. And here is a simple statistic. Since the COVID hysteria broke out in March of 2020, the US money supply has gone up by more than 40%, maybe 41%. That is meaningful. So that is what is happening. That is describing what is happening. So in other words, if your after-tax wealth hasn't grown by 40% since March of 2020, you're losing ground. And that's most people. Most people haven't made 40%. Their net worth, their after-tax net worth hasn't gone up by the rate of monetary debasement since March of 2020. What does that mean? It means everybody's getting poorer. And who's responsible for making everybody poor? Well, it's Jerome Powell and all these central bankers. That's who the real responsibility, that's who has the real responsibility. And that's the real way to look at it. So if you're not, look at how fast they're inflating the money supply. And if your net worth is not keeping up with that, then you are losing ground.
Mm-hmm. Nick, does the federal debt really even matter anymore, considering that the Fed can just print or borrow any shortfalls into existence that it could need? And where do you think the end of that road could be, or is there even one?
Yes, I think it does matter, because the federal debt doesn't just go away. They have to pay interest on that debt. And with interest rates rising, it is going to burst the budget, frankly. So if interest rates, according to their crooked CPI statistic, inflation is like 8-9%. Okay, well, if you really want to fight inflation, you should bring interest rates up to that level. But they can't, because if interest rates went to 8 or 9%, the amount of money the federal government would spend on the interest expense would basically bankrupt it. Interest expense would become the biggest item in the budget. It would be bigger than the so-called Department of Defense, bigger than Social Security. So they can't even, so I think they're trapped. This is why I think they're going to have a jubilee or a reset or whatever you want to call it, because at the end of the day, they're trapped. They have no other options. They cannot raise interest rates to the point where it make a dent in inflation without bankrupting themselves. That means it's game over. And people have been talking about this for a long time, many decades, but it is actually here now, because back in the 80s, they could raise interest rates without bankrupting the federal government, and they did. Volcker did raise rates. If Volcker raised rates to the point he did back in the 80s, the U.S. government will go bankrupt, because they won't be able to pay because the debt has grown to such a level that if they're paying the interest rate on the debt, they wouldn't be able to pay for all the other stuff. So it has reached an end game, and I think we won't have to wait too long to see how it's going to play out. But I think it's going to play out in not a fun way, because what do governments do when they're trapped? They flip over the board and reset the system. And I think that's what's going to happen. So people this is not business as usual. This is a very desperate situation for these governments. And I think we can expect all sorts of shenanigans.
So, the hard money people have been warning about a situation like this for many years. So my question to you is, why does it matter now? And why is this bout of inflation different?
It's different because they can't counteract it. How they usually counteract inflation by raising rates, but as I just said, they can't raise rates to counteract this inflation without bankrupting themselves. That's why it's different. They could in the past, they could counteract inflation by raising rates without bankrupting themselves. Now they don't have that choice. They have basically they're screwed. So unless inflation magically comes down, they are not going to be able to tame it. And so inflation is going to run wild. I think they're going to let because they have all this debt, and the inflation, it melts away the value of the debt. And I think that is why they're going to choose inflation. I think we can expect a lot more price increases because they don't have a choice. If they did raise the rates to fight the inflation, they'd go bankrupt. So they're going to choose the inflationary price increase route, and I expect that's what will happen.
So, Nick, in times of crisis, we see powerful entities push through the systems that are most advantageous to them. Recently we've seen an example, let's say the travel restrictions being lifted in Canada. So do steps like this make you hopeful, or do you see the precedent as already being set? And as an effect of that, are you more suspicious?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixed bag. There are some reasons to be optimistic, and there are some reasons to be pessimistic. The whole COVID hysteria set some horrible precedents in terms of human freedom and government control. And it is good that's the bad part. And the bad guys they would like to make you live in the COVID regime permanently. They would love to make you live locked down, tag you like a piece of cattle, and control everything that you do. That's exactly what these people would love to do. They would love it. So thankfully, this stuff is being rolled back. Canada's rolling some of this stuff back. That's the positive news. People need to be vigilant, though, because who knows if somebody gets the sniffles again, maybe they'll start to roll this out again. Or there's already been whispers about people's energy bills are going up too much, and we're putting out too much CO2. We need to have climate lockdowns. The head of the EU called to flatten the curve for electricity bills. In the same language, they said to flatten the curve of COVID. So they're very clearly foreshadowing what they would like to do. So I see reasons for optimism, but I think people need to be very vigilant and make sure this kind of thing never, ever happens again.
In that spirit of climate lockdowns, I remember Doug Casey actually bringing that up originally. And I remember an example of that this year when we saw the heat waves in Europe. France told people that they had to stay inside. That was an official order from the government of France, I believe, to keep people from realizing that it was too hot out. It just seems so asinine.
It does. And there's other instances. I think there's an instance in Colorado where you have these so-called smart houses where people's thermometers or thermostats were just changed automatically over the internet because of electricity consumption. So no, these are anti-freedom technologies. Technology is a double-edged sword. It can be used for good and bad, and you can very clearly see the people who want to use it to control people and manipulate people and control and herd them into a certain way. So yes, I think they look if they would have gotten away. And you had the trucker protests in Canada. You had a lot of other people resisting these COVID measures. The state of Florida, Texas, South Dakota. If you wouldn't have had these people standing up against this, and they would have just rolled over, you can be sure we'd be in climate lockdowns right now. And that's what they wanted. I mean, it's very clear that's what they want. So I think people need to be vigilant for this because yes, there's been some victories that has been kind of rolled back. It's in the process of being rolled back. But look, we still have the TSA in the US. You still have to take your shoes off. You still can't take anything over 3 ounces of liquid on the plane. So these kinds of bureaucracies tend to entrench themselves permanently unless you roll them back quickly. So reasons to be optimistic, but also be vigilant because these sociopaths, quite frankly, they are sociopaths, are lurking and just waiting for the next crisis to come so they can roll out more of this kind of crap. And I promise you, they will.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nick, that was an excellent conversation today. Is there anything else on the top of your mind that you think is worth touching on before we wrap up?
Well, as we're speaking today, there was apparently a sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline going from Russia to Germany. And I think this is very significant because it basically means that the Germans have no choice. They will not be able to lift the sanctions on Russia, even if they wanted to now, because now this is going to cause huge problems for Europe. This is going to be a very, very interesting winter, how this all shakes out. So I think we're in one of the most volatile periods, certainly in my lifetime. And I think a lot of this stuff is coming to head in the winter. So I think people just need to, keep paying attention to what's going on, look for ways to protect themselves. And, hard assets are a wonderful thing. And let me just define hard assets. What I mean is hard to produce. That's what puts the hard in hard assets. That means that nobody else can make something easily, and that's what makes it a good store of value. You don't want to store your value, store your life savings in something that is easy to produce for somebody else. Why would you want to do that? It makes no sense. You want to store your life savings in something that somebody else can't make easily. So I put gold, Bitcoin, and silver in that bucket, but I think gold and Bitcoin are the better stores of value there. So people should be prepared. Don't put your savings into unbacked liabilities. The money in the bank account can very easily go away. Saw this in Canada with how people at the drop of a hat, oh, we're going to freeze people's bank accounts. This can happen anywhere. So people need to be prepared for this kind of stuff, because I think we are really going to see some wild things in the months ahead.
Nick, you've mentioned that you prefer gold over silver a couple times here. Why is that?
Well, I think because you can measure an asset's hardness. So we're talking about hard assets. And an easier way to think of hardness is resistance to inflation. I think gold is more resistant, the gold supply is more resistant to being inflated than the silver supply is. And you can see that in something called the stock to flow ratio, which measures, it's basically, it tells you how much the current supply is growing each year in relation to the overall stockpiles. So gold, it's just the inverse of the supply growth. So gold grows very predictably 1% to 2% per year. And there's not much anybody can do to change that. And in fact, gold is the one commodity that is the most resistant to inflation. Silver is the second most resistant to inflation, but it has a larger share of annual production relative to its existing stockpiles, which means that annual production can swing the market balance much more than it can for gold. So I view silver is more, I would want to have silver as an emergency spending. So maybe you get like 100 silver 1-ounce coins to, like, if things really get nasty, you can use that to buy groceries. You don't want to buy groceries with a 1-ounce gold coin. That's just too much value. But a silver coin is just about right. So I would have enough silver coins for these kinds of emergency spending scenarios. I think silver is great for that. But in terms of long-term savings, I think that hands down, gold is way better for long-term savings because it's a harder asset. And you can measure its hardness. It's a much harder asset than silver is. And just to touch on this topic too, because hardness is very important. Hardness is in my opinion, is the most important monetary attribute. It's more important than any other monetary attribute, because if something is not resistant to inflation, it's going to be a crappy form of money. None of these other things matter if somebody can inflate the supply easily. So people look at like, here's an interesting example: platinum and palladium. These are actually not, contrary to what people believe, these are not hard assets. Why? There are actually fewer platinum and palladium ounces in the world than there are gold. So it's rarer than gold, but it's not harder than gold. Why? It's because annual production of platinum and palladium is about equal or more than the existing stockpiles. So that means annual production rocks the market. It would totally, you wouldn't want to store your value, have it as a long-term savings, because each year you're going to be worried, oh, how much platinum did they produce this year? How much palladium did they produce this year? It's much more of an industrial metal. It's not a monetary metal for that exact reason. So that's why gold, you're not really worried about how much gold, like if you're a gold owner, I mean, it's going to increase 1% to 2% per year. Not very
predictable.
Very predictable, and that makes it a very good monetary use. So in my view, that's what's the most important thing in determining what is a good form of money. It's resistance to inflation, and gold as a commodity is number one. Bitcoin is in there too. I know there's some complications there, but it is definitely resistant to inflation. Show me how you can increase the Bitcoin supply. I'd be happy to hear it. I don't think anybody can, but in any case, that's what you want to look for in a money. Make sure nobody else can make it easily.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, Nick. Well, I appreciate you walking us through your thinking on that. For anybody that would like to, read any more of your stuff, of course, you're available at financialunderground.com and at Nick Giambruno on Twitter. Anywhere else you'd like to point to, Nick?
No, those are the places to go on the financialunderground.com. I've got a couple of good special reports on gold and Bitcoin that elaborate these thoughts a little further in case people want to check those out. But yep, those are the main places to find me.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for your time today, Nick. Really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, Tom.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.